I'm going to talk to you today about there's two aspects really. First of all, I'm going to tell you a bit about the previous projects that the East Anglian Traditional Music Trust ran between 2003 and 2009, which was stimulated by the work of Vaughan Williams in the Eastern Counties. And then secondly, I'm going to tell you about some of my research, which is what that handout is, since retiring from the Trust in 2017, and point you towards where the updates on the original research are now. It's all online, so that's why I've given you the handout, because it's not like I can give you a book or sell you a book or whatever. So we're going to look at the subject of publications in a later session, but I will just give a quick mention of one book which actually provided the inspiration for the Trust Vaughan Williams projects in the first place. Roy Palmer has already been referred to. Roy Palmer's 1983 publication, Folk Songs Collected by Vaughan Williams, as far as I'm aware, was the first book in which any of the Suffolk songs were published. There were 4 from Southold and 4 from South Suffolk, plus Red Running Roo, which Mary referred to this morning, which, as we heard, was sung by Billy Waggs from Orwell, which is, of course, in Cambridgeshire, but I think Roy Palmer must have been misled by the Orwell River being in Suffolk, and he listed it with the Suffolk songs at number 86, as you can see there. And in fact, in that book, 40% of the 120 songs were from the Eastern Counties, so a significant number. My role in the East Anglian Traditional Music Trust Vaughan Williams projects, apart from inventing them and managing them, was in researching the songs and the social and oral history. And I brought in other people to work on the interpretation, the performance, and the teaching of the songs. It's hard to believe that the song material we had to work with then were actually negative images. You've seen a few images already of Vaughan Williams manuscripts. By the time we started working on it, and no doubt other people in the room as well, they were negative images taken from the microfiche copies of the original manuscripts. They were really hard to read. You've heard about Vaughan Williams' famously spidery handwriting, and see it in negative form as well, and it's really, really hard. And I was trying to find an image to show you, but I could only find this one, which is not in Vaughan Williams' hands. This is Rosamund Strode's cataloguing of Vaughan Williams' manuscripts, which she did in the 1960s, and she had much clearer handwriting than Vaughan Williams. You'll see among the list of the singers' names in the centre, one Ben Hur, and this was the name which caught our attention first in Roy Palmer's book, conjuring images, for me, as maybe for some of you, of that 1959 film epic starring Charlton Heston. That was Ben Hur with one R. A very different story. But it just sort of jumped off the page and we thought, oh, look at that. And that eventually led to the creation of a project called Blythe Valley Voices. Blythe Valley Voices became a template for other projects in succeeding years, which also explored the work of Vaughan Williams. Waveney Voices, which was the Diss and Howson area in the South Norfolk, and North End Voices, Kings Lynn. And in 2009, we organised a day conference called Vaughan Williams in the East, bringing together all our work up to that point, alongside fellow researchers Sue Cubbin and Mary Humphreys, who you've heard from this morning. And in that same year, Mary was also lead tutor in a commission that the Trust had for the Cambridge Music Festival. So each of these projects included the following elements. Just need to tell my techie person there's different points coming up, so... But wait for the big reveal. They all included the following elements: research into the songs collected by Vaughan Williams and others in these locations, research into local singers, both those visited by Vaughan Williams and other singers, research into the circumstances of the collecting trip, and then publication in various forms, exhibitions, books, radio and media coverage, and articles on the Trust website and other places, singing workshops for adults, schools workshops, and a final concert involving schools, adults from the project workshop, and other local singers and musicians. So you can see it was partly research and partly getting it out there, just like this current project or forthcoming project is to be as well. And we'll take a little look at each of the Trust projects in a little bit more detail now. Blythe Valley Voices, I'm sure you've had time today already to have a look at the exhibition boards that are up in the hall here. It was designed to be portable, and In the picture on the right here, you can see it in situ in Cecil Sharp House in London. It was also on display for several months in the Southwold Museum and various other locations and events. The boards contain photos and information on many aspects of traditional song, music and dance in Southwold, including the panel seen here on the left about Vaughan Williams' collecting trip there in 1910. And I do need to say now that both that trip to Southwold and the one he made to South Norfolk actually involved fellow folk song collector George Butterworth as well. But back in the noughties, our focus really was on Vaughan Williams, although we did, of course, consult Butterworth's manuscripts too. And for example, it was he who named the singer of the song The Royal George, where Vaughan Williams' manuscript gave no names. A lot of my research at that time focused on the singers, particularly the aforementioned Ben Hur and two of his brothers, William and Robert. In those days, very little genealogical research could be done online, so I made regular trips to the Suffolk Record Office, and I was also able to trace some surviving family members who provided much information and anecdotes and photographs. We brought in Chris Coe, who's seen in the left-hand photograph, to work on the songs themselves and to deliver workshops for both adults and children. The children in that photo are on stage in St Edmund's Hall in Southwold, which is adjacent to St Edmund's Church, and I shall never forget the feeling when switching the lights off in the hall as we left after the concert and glancing over to the churchyard and thinking that we'd just been singing the songs of the men who were buried just the other side of the wall. A very moving moment. We published what we believed were all the songs collected by Vaughan Williams on that trip to Southwold, although we actually missed one. As well as much of the background information in the Blythe Voices book that Nikki just showed you in 2003, and that went into a second edition in 2008. The missing song was William Hur's Betsy of Yarmouth, which was found in George Butterworth's manuscript. As I said, the two men went together. Although Vaughan Williams did note it, it's not attributed or dated, and it's actually got catalogued under the title Kind Betsy Farmer, so that's my excuse for missing it first time round. Actually, my excuse for missing it first time round is that the librarian sent us all the stuff that they identified, and they didn't send that. Just remember that. Looking at the book that we published 19 years, unbelievably 19 years later, it would be good to add several things. It would be good to add round numbers and to make a correction or two. For example, the contents page gives Ben Hur as the singer of The Rich Old Farmer, and that error has been transferred into the Vaughan Williams Memorial Library catalogue. But there you go, it was what, at the time, but it'd be nice to revisit it and make those corrections, really. In 2004, there was a 30-minute radio programme broadcast on BBC Radio 4 called Blythe Valley Voices, presented by Paul Heine, who was, I don't know if he still is actually, he was one of the Trust's patrons anyway. Vaughan Williams and Butterworth noted down 15 songs, a toast, and one dance tune played by Robert Hur on the concertina. As well as the three Hur brothers, they also visited Charles Newby, a retired pub landlord and coal dealer living just outside the town in Raydon, and Mrs. Martha Cable, or Keeble, living in the village of Shaddingfield, a little further inland. I'm going to pick up on some of the more recent stuff in a bit more detail in the sort of second half of the talk. So the second project we did was called Waveney Voices. And this took place in the small town of Howson near Diss during 2005. School and adult workshops were once again led by Chris Coe, and the community project culminated in an afternoon concert as part of Howson and Waveney Arts Festival. This was a slightly smaller project on a smaller budget, and no book or permanent exhibition was produced, but the research findings were published on the Trust website, and in fact that webpage was one of the last that I updated before my retirement. We were still working from negative images from the microfiches at that point, although it was only a couple of years later, in 2007, that George Butterworth's manuscripts were digitised, giving us much clearer images like the one on this slide. Butterworth's notes and manuscripts were of particular importance in this project in South Norfolk, enabling several of the singers to be identified properly. And although it's sometimes referred to as their Diss trip, the two men did no collecting in the town itself, but visited the Deptford Union Workhouse on the A140 at Pulham Market and the nearby villages of Tibbenham, Gissing and Scole. They probably travelled just by train. This is all sounding familiar now, isn't it, if you haven't heard it all before? And they may have stayed in the town, visiting the outlying villages where they found songs by bicycle, as that was their usual mode of working, but there's no concrete proof of this in Dis. They were there for 3 days, 19th, 20th and 21st of December 1911. They met 11 singers and collected, by my calculations, 24 songs. They met 3 singers in the workhouse and the others in their homes, and also 2 pubs. We definitely know the pubs, the Boot in Tibenham and the Horseshoes in Gissing. And on this page, on this page from Vaughan Williams' manuscript, below the song called Cold Irons, which he collected in the workhouse, is an assessment of the songs they found in the area, a bit tricky to read as ever, but what it says is 5 first-rate songs, 9 good, 5 moderate and 6 passable, which adds up to 25, so either his maths or mine is wrong. The third project in this series was the longest lasting and reached the biggest number of people in terms of workshops and live performances. North End Voices was based in the north end of King's Lynn, as you've heard from Liz and Jill this morning. It was once a small, tight-knit fishing community, but by the early 2000s, when we were carrying out these projects, it's a bit of no man's land, really, between the gorgeous historic quarter and the not-so-gorgeous industrial wastelands of North Lynn. The area is redeemed by the towering spire of the Fisherman's Church, St Nicholas Chapel, where the Reverend Alfred Huddle was the curate, and the few remaining old buildings in Pilot Street and St Anne Street, including Truth Yard Museum, with whom we worked closely. The North End Voices community project ran in various guises from 2005 to 2007, starting life as part of the Trust's own playback project, with a workshop and short performances of songs. And in 2006, we worked with the Church's Conservation Trust to teach some of the songs to local school children, taught by Jeannie Harris as part of a fishing heritage festival held in the town. In 2007, we were approached by BBC Radio Norfolk to be involved in an oral history project, and we ran an adult workshop and more schools workshops and carried out further research. And you'll see in these pictures Alan Howson, who you've just heard playing live. He worked with 4 local primary schools, and the children's songs were filmed for a feature on the BBC Radio Norfolk website, which was online until quite recently. I think I saw it there about a year ago, but it's gone now. Meanwhile, Chris Coe worked with adults who performed several songs live to a packed audience in St Nicholas Chapel as part of another very moving community concert. We produced a temporary exhibition. I think we saw that on the previous slide, but you've seen the actual proper one outside in the other room now. That was upgraded with funding from the RVW Society to properly designed permanent paddles. And we also produced a self-published booklet, North End Voices, which was, I think, more or less the text of the exhibition. Certainly didn't contain all the songs. And as I mentioned earlier, we rounded off that phase of work with a one-day conference in 2009, Vaughan Williams in the East, and that's a flyer for it there. And so I'm going to move on to part 2 now, which is quite different. I'm going to tell you a bit about the research into Vaughan Williams and Butterworth visits that I've been working on since my retirement from the Trust in 2017. I'm just going to put this slide up briefly. The details of where to find stuff are on the handout, so you don't need to read that in detail, but you can just see that I've continued to research all 3 locations for the original Trust Vaughan Williams projects, and also look at an area of Suffolk that we did not investigate then. Several years after the initial research, I was of course able to consult new sources of information, but I also chose deliberately in this phase of research to look at some different aspects in each of the 3 locations we explored originally through Trust projects. In Southwold, I revisited the Southwold song collecting trip in some detail in 2017 to write up on my website, and I've already told you about a couple of oversights in the original research and publications. And then I revisited it in 2021 for a presentation for the Traditional Song Forum. I think that's the first mention they've had today, unless my ears deceive me, but a very, I was going to say venerable, but it's not that venerable. It's 25 years old organisation that does some fantastic work, brings together researchers from all over the world these days. That was a presentation called Up from the Sea, and for that presentation I chose to look at some of the many artists and photographers who recorded the fishing community visually, and that included a legendary photographer, P.H. Emerson, who's completely fascinated me, and also the letters and other writings of members of the artistic and literary community associated with Southwold, which included George Orwell. None of the singers whom Vaughan Williams and Butterworth met appeared directly in any of these works, but it has certainly helped to place their visit and the singers' activities into a wider context. This characterful little drawing recalls a night in the Harbour Inn around the time of Vaughan Williams' visit to Southwold. So do you know Southwold? It still has a regular music session there. It's about a mile or so out of the town, down by the river. And this was actually around the time of Vaughan Williams' visit in 1911, and by an obscure artist called John Walter George, who was an art teacher on holiday from London. Seated in the middle in the black hat is basket maker Billy Rogers, who was known to be a singer, and indeed in this drawing I really do think he does seem to be singing and the others to be listening. Billy was known for his rendition of In the Shade of the Old Apple Tree, which in 1911 would of course have been a relatively modern song. Vaughan Williams and Butterworth do not appear to have visited the Harbour Inn, or indeed any of the other pubs in Southwold where sing-songs are known to have taken place, such as the Southwold Arms, where they had singing competitions in the 19th century, and the Nelson and the Red Lion. One of the valuable resources which has only recently come to light has been some tape recordings made by Bob Jellicoe in the 1970s. Visual aid. On which his recent book, just published this year, Shorelines, that was based on his recordings made in the 1970s. And he was making them for oral history purposes, of community history purposes, I would say. So he didn't actually record any songs, but there were memories of singing. And on Billy Rogers here, his brother Bertie remembered singing in the Victoria. God, there used to be uproar in there. Go on, they'd yell, give us another bit on it. Us youngsters used to be in there along with the old men. There were some hectic Saturday nights in there, especially if they'd done a bit of fishing. And perhaps one of the clues here is that Vaughan Williams and Butterworth were in Southwold on a Monday and Tuesday, and the references to singing in pubs tend to mention weekends. So although Jellicoe did not record songs in Southwold in the 1970s, my late husband John Howson did so in the 1980s, in particular from John Dusso Winter. And interestingly, he found none of the songs that Vaughan Williams had collected 70 years earlier still in circulation. That's a theme that I'll pick up again in a few minutes. In investigating the artistic visitors to Southwold, I uncovered an interesting link. Musician and composer Martin Shaw, who's seen here on the left, spent many childhood holidays in Southwold, indeed a whole summer in 1888 when he was recouping from whooping cough. And he maintained a regular association with the town throughout his life, eventually retiring there in the 1940s. As a young man in the 1890s, he met Vaughan Williams at the Royal College of Music, and this was the start of an enduring friendship, which included professional collaborations on the English Carol Book and numerous editions of Songs of Praise. Now, Martin Shaw, his abiding childhood memory of Southwold was of one George Herr, a fisherman, a lodging house keeper, and a singer. George taught me to swim and to smoke, he wrote in his autobiography. He used to take me out trawling all night. When the nets were down, he would while away the time by singing very slowly an interminable ballad with the refrain, which I thought really ill-timed, and the salt water was his grave. So Shaw would undoubtedly have made Vaughan Williams aware of the folk song possibilities in Southwold, although it appears to have been a letter from a man called John Gooding that actually triggered the visit in October 1910. The following year, in August, Vaughan Williams wrote to Shaw, "The man who sings well is William Herr, asking for Lovely Joan and Loss of the London, and get some more." But there's, however, no indication that Shaw noted down any songs from the Herrs or anyone else, and it was left to the folk song specialists, Williams and Butterworth, to follow up William Herr's songs on a brief return visit to Southwold in December 1911, and they never did meet George Herr, who was, of course, brother to William, Robert and Ben. Vaughan Williams had also corresponded with Shaw about his South Norfolk trip, The British Library has an undated letter written by Vaughan Williams from his address in Cheney Walk in Chelsea. Dear Shaw, I'm off tomorrow folk songing near Scole. If you have any advice to offer, will you send me a card? Post Office, Dis, Norfolk. So it does sound like you're staying in Dis. In 2017, I was contacted by Stuart Morgan and asked if I would contribute to a film he was making about the life of George Butterworth, entitled All My Life's Buried Here. This gave me an opportunity to re-evaluate Butterworth's role in the South Norfolk and South Wold song collecting trips, and this aspect is written up on my own website and in an essay in the booklet which accompanies the DVD of the film. The film has been described as the best film made about a composer's life, and I'm not going to disagree with that. Not that I've watched that many others, actually. It's a superb film. It was shown across the country and locally at Dis Cornhall and Oldborough Cinema, where I did Q&As after the screening, and it is still available on DVD. I don't have any in stock, but I've got one here if you want to look it up and see where to get one from. And there is a website for that. So you've seen this picture before, but it's about the only time that I think I've managed to repeat anything. Online resources, especially newspapers, have revealed so much more to us. They've really revolutionised searching through digitisation. You know, the idea of finding some of these things through looking through them in person, in the actual papers would just be years and years of work. So what I've put up here is a little kind of a jigsaw, just as an insight into the kind of things us researchers get very excited about. In King's Lynn, newspapers and criminal records that have been digitised have enabled that positive identification for the person Liz mentioned before, Lolly and Lol Benifer, who sang Barbary Allen and the Farmer's Daughter to Vaughan Williams. And it's also those kind of online sources that we've been able to search and find the confirmation that it was the Reverend Alfred Huddle who introduced Vaughan Williams to the North End Singers. But it's taken us collectively years to identify Lol Benifer. And for years I thought, you can see on the little bit of the negative image there, for years I thought I said Leslie Benifer. It seemed a highly unlikely name, but that's what it looked like. And I've just indicated a few of the jigsaw pieces that were needed to identify her. Top right is a very short excerpt from a very long article from the Lynn News in June 1882 about the inquest held on a young man called James Stannard, who died following a violent altercation with a neighbouring family, the Baileys, in Whitening Yard in the North End. And you can see there are a list of family members towards the bottom: William Bailey and his wife, Mrs. Maule, Lol Bailey and Naomi Bailey, and it's really that Lol Bailey, with seeing the Lol in print, I think that was the bit that brought everything else together. Top left is a criminal register from Norwich Jail, showing the sentencing of 4 of those family members, and on the bottom line is Harriet Ann Bailey. Harriet Ann Bailey married Henry Benifer, and the bottom photograph is Harriet Ann Bailey, known as Lol Benifer, who sang the songs. Why are these things important? Well, if you're mostly interested in the melody, maybe they're not so important. But if you're interested in the words to a song and why a singer might have chosen to sing them, it's of more significance. For me, looking at Lol's life history and also Noah Fisher from South Norfolk, their song choices seem really very relevant to their lives and quite poignant, and suggest that they weren't just singing the songs handed down to them, but they were deliberately choosing songs which held meaning for them, just as singers do today. Why should we be surprised? Well, sometimes you just need to sort of step outside and see that thing from a different angle. So my own focus in more recent years has been on placing Vaughan Williams' findings in the context of other evidence of folk singing in the town. And contemporary with the singers that you've heard Jill and Liz talk about this morning were other singers from the fishing community in the North End, such as Tom Centre, Sam Southgate, and Edward Wacker Bunn, who won a singing competition. It was for a long song. There seemed to be quite a feature, this thing, doesn't it? The long song thing. And he won it with a ballad that the man who wrote it down, Frank Castleton, wrote down as Lord Bacon. I think a lot of us know that's Lord Bateman to you and me. We also know about singers in King's Lynn, again from within the fishing community, dating back to the 1870s and forward to the mid-20th century, So there's a unique opportunity here to explore wider contexts of Vaughan Williams singers, which is what I've been looking at. And the sources which enabled this wider and deeper view are, first of all, from the 1870s, this songbook, which was owned by Henry Flanders, who lived right where Truesyard Fishing Museum is now. I first came across this in 2014, but since then, I found out much more about the book, the contents, and the owner and his family, although the original book remains in private hands in New Zealand. I've written about Henry Flanders' songbook on my Unsung Histories website, which I developed in the 2020 lockdown in order to publish more of my research on a wider variety of subjects, so I'm not going to go into that in detail now, but there's plenty to read there if you're interested in it. The mid-20th century evidence comes from two sources. Not that that's a source, but it's an illustration. Firstly, again, Liz and Jill mentioned sort of in passing some things that some recordings made in the mid-20th century. Firstly, recordings made by song collector Mike Herring in the 1960s. For some time, these actual recordings were lost, although luckily Liz had transcribed them. I had a light bulb moment when a friend from another part of the country was talking to me about some archive recordings that they had, and I suddenly just went, these must be the ones from King's Lynn, and sure enough they were, and they're now lodged back with the transcripts in Truesyard Museum. Careful genealogical and oral history research has revealed that two of the 1960s singers, Bustle Smith and Boots Spenifer, were descendants of some of the 1905 singers, and that's on the family tree. I noticed that is in Liz and Jill's book as well. And Boots Spenifer, who was Lowell Spenifer's son, was one of several men in the later 20th century who knew this song, The Haring Scaring Fisherman, which is otherwise known as Dogger Bank. And it's now immortalised in a local recreation ground, that's Loke Road Recreation Ground, by this carving, which is quite amazing really, isn't it? It's not my photograph, unfortunately, it's off the net, but there you go. Again, that's published on my research on song history, published on my website on Song Histories. And the other mid-century source is from a 1955 radio programme featuring several singers from King's Lynn, including the aptly named Charlie Fish, in a programme devised and presented by John Seymour. Unfortunately, the radio programmes themselves no longer seem to exist, but a wonderfully detailed report in the Lynn News gives the flavour of the lively recording event in the Tilden Smith pub, organised by Seymour for the purposes of the radio recording, and it lists the singers and the songs. John Seymour's name may be familiar to you. He's best known now as a guru of the self-sufficiency movement in the late 1960s and 70s, but he was a writer and radio broadcaster on a variety of countryside and environmental subjects, and was fond of traditional singing and music, although he was never a formal collector, preferring to immerse himself in the situation rather than record it for posterity. In 2021, I gave a presentation to the Folk Voice Conference entitled 100 Years of Singing in a Fishing Community, King's Lynn 1870 to 1970. I hoped to be able to trace some of the songs through the generations, but in fact, much to the found in Southwold, there was barely a song in common between the 1870s, the 1900s, when Vaughan Williams collected there, and the mid-century selections. So instead, I looked at the songs by theme, as you can see here, and this is just a very brief look. The sort of crunchy bits are at the bottom there, really. I think the thing that interested me most is having done some folk song collecting, or at least John mostly did it, and how many comic songs we were offered that maybe Vaughan Williams was offered them, but he didn't note them down. There were none at all, whereas they definitely featured before and afterwards. And the analysis I've made in recent years suggests that there were many more singers around in King's Lynn in 1905, but they were probably younger, probably singing in pubs, and possibly singing a more recent repertoire than Vaughan Williams would have been interested in at the time. And while that might sound negative, given that this time in the town was limited, we just need to be really grateful that he managed to note down so many old songs with such stunning melodies. So that rounds up the updates on the areas that we worked on at the Trust in previous years. And finally, I'll just tell you a little bit about Vaughan Williams in South I can't say this, South Suffolk, which we never really investigated in that earlier phase, but which I have picked up on since retirement. This is still very much work in progress and not ready for publication yet. So between the 30th of August and the 4th of September 1907, and I was interested to try and tie that in with the dates he was in Cambridge, because that was just afterwards. I don't know whether he was still at Meldreth then or whether he was on his way back to London. Yeah. So, he had about 5 days around, and he collected 15 songs and some snatches of tunes in and around Hadley in South Suffolk. The singers he visited were in Hadley itself, Jake Willis, Robert Clark, and a Mr. Broom, plus a Mr. Warner, whom he met in the Shoulder of Mutton pub, which is the green building in the photograph here. And in nearby villages, he noted songs from Mr. Ansell in the Bell Inn in Kersey, which is that wonderful half-timbered building, and from a Mrs. Tiffin in Holton St Mary, and an unnamed singer in the Cosford Union Workhouse in Seamer, which is the bottom right picture. I've carried out some genealogical research, which has enabled me to positively identify singer Jake Willis. There were a few more clues, rather than just having, like, Mr. Smith, his unusual name, and also Vaughan Williams did write down that he had fought in the Crimean War and the Indian Mutiny, so I was able to identify him as Jacob Willis, who is a general labourer and an ex-soldier. And I'm fairly confident in identifying Robert Clark as the licensee of the White Hart, but the other singers are much trickier to identify positively at the moment. There's a 1901 census return at the bottom with Jake Willis and his wife Emily on the last 2 lines. And what that doesn't show is that Jake Willis was in fact invalided out of the army, having lost a foot, and so he was fairly disabled. And by the 1911 census, he was also blind. So that's work in progress. I'm just going to squeeze in one tiny last detail, just a little tantalising factoid concerning singing in the county's largest town, Ipswich. Early in 1906, Vaughan Williams received a note from fellow song collector George Gardner, suggesting that he follow up a Mr. Wilson in Ipswich, who had learned songs from old Jim Baker, a noted singer now dead. There's no evidence that Vaughan Williams did in fact follow this up, and there's so little to go on here except that Mr. Wilson was possibly an employee of Ransom's engineers that unsurprisingly I've not yet been able to identify either of these 2 singers. However, George Butterworth also visited Ipswich in 1912 when he collected Mary Bloomfield, William Taylor and The Tree in the Wood from an unnamed singer in an unspecified location. I've only an unsupported idea about who he might have been visiting there, and no evidence at all of who the singer was. So that's not even work in progress, I say. It's just a little tantalising tidbit to be going on with. So that's me for today. I'd just like to thank the people and the organisations who've helped with the research, and to thank you for listening, and to thank the East Anglian Traditional Music Trust for organising the day. It's a pleasure to contribute and not to organise.